Ladies and gents, welcome back in, and I do appreciate it. It's getting quite warm in here as well. So those of you who haven't taken your jackets off and were maintaining some sort of formality, please feel free. Okay, our final session is entitled Enhancing Stakeholder Engagement, and at the end there will be a chance for your questions to our two panelists, both of whom are going to make a short speech first of all. It has been a most interesting few months for the Chief Executive of the Jockey Club in Great Britain, Nevin Truesdale, because not only has he had his normal complement of responsibilities and looking after some of the most high-profile racecourses in Britain and the world, he and his team have also had to contend with the growing threat of animal rights protesters. He is going to tell you much more about how they've dealt with that during the course of the last year. It is quite a story as well. Nevin Truesdale, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Nick. Good afternoon, everyone. If I can get these slides to work, there we go, yes. Yes, as Nick says, something of a parable, I think, to tell you this afternoon, but I think it comes at quite a good time in our timetable today, actually, because it draws together a number of the themes we've been hearing, actually, throughout the day. You know, Natalie told us about the expectations of Generation Z around use of animals, especially use of animals in sport, and the changing expectations of that. We're seeing that very much in the UK as well. We've heard about some of the relentless focus on welfare and some of the changes that have been made, that this episode gave us the opportunity to go and talk positively and confidently about, and I think it's right that racing gets on the front foot on that and uses it as a platform, and that's a theme I'll keep coming back to. But I think what it also told us, actually more than anything in my mind, was that we need to operate together on this. Again, it's a theme that Natalie picked up on earlier, which I entirely agree with, because we want to attract new people, new fans into this sport. That's a key part of our strategy at the Jockey Club. We're only going to be able to do that if we are absolutely relentless around some of the changes that we need to make to improve what is already a very strong record on equine welfare. But we are in no position at all to be complacent on that. And I think, again, going back to what Natalie said, that very much picking up on some of those themes. So this threat that we were facing earlier this year, I think, brought a lot of those themes together and allowed us to really think and reflect on some of those things. So I'm going to divide this into two. I'm not going to talk about the Jockey Club in the UK because most of you know what we do, largest commercial operator in the sport. Main job is to run, as Nick said, some of the biggest and some of the smaller race courses as well, but other businesses too. But obviously, if we're going to be commercially successful as a sport, to pick up on a theme from Josh, we need to be relentless on attracting new people in. And in order to be able to do that, changing some of these misconceptions and some of these perceptions around welfare is absolutely critical. That's why across the Jockey Club, and this is something we were able to talk about in our PR communications during the animal rising threat, we have very specific activity and relentless focus on investment, data analysis, and what we call communications and campaigning. Those are the three sort of bases, if you like, of how we operate and why we put it at the heart of everything we do. And we have a ring-fenced investment model where we say we need to do X, Y, and Z jobs on our racecourses this year to improve the quality of our tracks, to improve the quality of our horse walk areas, our stables, our washdown areas, you name it. And the data analysis on the side there tells us where we should be focusing. And that's done in conjunction with the team, Brant's team and James's teams at the British Horse Racing Authority, and obviously sharing knowledge with the rest of the industry and other race courses as well. So it's absolutely at the heart of what we do. And thank God it is, because when we were facing in April of this year, or from March, April this year, I think something that we probably never anticipated in terms of the extent and the imminence of the threat. We're all used historically to seeing animal rights protesters protesting perfectly peacefully and normally outside big racing events. We've seen that at Cheltenham, at Aintree, at Royal Ascot, at all our big racing events for many, many years. This was something entirely different. And it really fed off the theme that was going round in the UK in quarter one of this year. We had Just Stop Oil protesters. We had Extinction Rebellion gluing themselves to bridges in London, holding up traffic, generally taking what they saw as legitimate direct action to bring people's attention to the climate crisis and to reduce use or eliminate use of fossil fuels. Again, another theme from Natalie, and I'm stealing shamelessly from you here, Natalie, so apologies. The relationship between the climate protesters and animal rights protesters, there's a lot of overlap. And Animal Rising, as they became known, Animal Rebellion, they actually rebranded in the middle of all this, not sure why, but they did, were very clear that their intention was to start disrupting any sporting event involving animals. And indeed, we saw it actually in lots of sporting events from Just Stop Oil later on in the summer, from sporting events not involving animals. We saw them at the rugby, the Premiership final. We saw them even at the Chelsea Flower Show. And we saw them liberating some lambs from Sandringham as well. So the extent of the activity was significant. But the key focus for them, and the key battleground, if you will, was around racing. And why was that? Because racing in the UK and probably around the world has one of the biggest platforms for these sort of protests, for them to get maximum publicity. And that ultimately is what they're attempting to do. And there was a degree to which, as a sport, I guess we should be flattered in a way, but we were being used as a platform for what actually was a much wider cause than just welfare and horse racing. Because it soon emerged that the agenda was actually about, as again referring back to something that Natalie touched on, was around Generation Z expectations of our whole relationship as a human race with animals. And the ultimate intention, as they saw it, to set animals free. There was even talk on some of the intelligence we picked up about raiding training yards. So obviously that was something pretty significant for us in Newmarket, the National Stud, and training yards all over the country, and certainly put people on alert. But the profile events were what they were really targeting. And they were very clear from the outset that the Grand National was the first target. And this emerged in the form of effectively a sting operation in a well-known Sunday newspaper about 10 days before the event. Now, we picked up some intel from Merseyside Police, who are the local police force in Liverpool, that this was potentially imminent and was potentially going to happen. It was confirmed by this story. What effectively happened was that a reporter had got in, obviously, as an undercover, and managed to sting the operation and to be clear that, pick up the intel that this interruption was likely to happen. And then suddenly, we've got a national media story on our hands, 10 days before the one race in the UK that probably transcends the entire sport. I mean, all of those of you who know the Grand National will know that it is the one race that stops our country, more so than anything at Cheltenham or anything at Royal Ascot or anything anywhere else. And therefore, suddenly, it's a national news story. So what happens at that point? Well, obviously on the ground, we're putting in significant extra security, as you'd expect, 24/7 protection of the site, additional CCTV, lots of work on police intel as well. But also, you've got the spotlight shone very clearly on our record on equine welfare, because that's what Animal Rising we're talking about, and that's what we needed to respond to. And the media got this annoying habit of putting us sort of against each other on these debate programs, on the news. And there were, it felt like we needed to be really well organized around our comms on that. I wasn't a big fan of going head-to-head with people, but we couldn't empty chair it. So we were in a position where it actually became a platform for us to get our message across around the improvements we'd made, not just to the Grand National, but to jumps racing in general, backed up by data and statistics and very clear messages that this race and this sport has never been safer, but equally that you would never and you can never eliminate risk entirely. And of course, if we take some of Brian's themes from the last session, it then becomes incumbent on us to talk about, well, what are you going to do to reduce risk even further? So having that platform and being able to talk about that positively, racing doesn't normally have that. So in some ways, and as I remember saying to Nick on his program, in some ways it was a huge opportunity for us, but it was an opportunity, a real double-edged sword. But it was the right thing for us to be really proactive and clear that that was what we wanted to do and to really get across our record on that. You all know what happened. Most of you know what happened on the day. I'm not going to recount that, but it certainly was, a pretty stressful 15, 20 minutes for a lot of people in our business, and the impact on our people and our teams and our internal comms around it was something we had to deal with in the aftermath as well, and obviously not something we've talked about in public. But it really brought home some of these issues, and it really brought home the expectations of society around us. The other theme that was really important for us, it was really important for us to start winning the case for reasonable opinion. Because what happened after the Grand National? They contacted us directly with a message about the Epsom Derby, which, as most of you know, was the first Saturday in June, 6 weeks or so after the National. And they said, we delayed the Grand National. We see that as a semi-victory. We are going to turn up with 1,000 people at Epsom to disrupt the Derby as well. And of course, those of you who know Epsom know that it's a very open site. It's almost as if someone's just built a racing strip in the middle of the Epsom Downs with a few railings around it and left it there. So it's a very accessible site and much, much harder to defend than Aintree is. So at this point, we did see this as a real operational threat. And it was at that stage that we really kicked into gear, both on the operation side and security, closing off paths, 4,000 metres of 6 feet Harris fencing, you name it, we did it to protect the site. We'd actually done it 3 years before when we raced the Derby behind closed doors because of COVID, so we had a bit of practice. We didn't think we'd have to do that again so soon, but there it was for a very different reason. But again, we had the same themes leading up, and we were much, much tighter on our comms this time. And I'll come back to that theme because having a clear set of messages as an industry that everyone can be singing off that same hymn sheet became really, really important for us in the lead up and the aftermath to Epsom. But the other thing, as I mentioned, is they offered to meet us. And Julie and I got a similar email, actually pretty much, I think, probably at the same time, on the same day. And again, back to my theme about winning the argument for reasonable opinion, being the calm, rational, reasonable party in the debate, we decided pretty quickly that we needed to meet them. So we did. And I know there's a Racing Post correspondent in the room, but it was a productive meeting. But the headline was around the fact that we shared donuts with them. That's what was picked up more than anything else in terms of the theming from that meeting. But actually, some good things did come out of it. Their view was, we're still going to disrupt your race. Our view was, we will accommodate you, we will be reasonable to you, we will give you an area outside Epsom Racecourse to protest peacefully, which we did, and our team worked with them on that subsequent to the meeting to get that set up. I think about 40 people turned up in the end, but we bent over backwards to accommodate them in protesting peacefully, because it was very important for us to show that we're not against peaceful protest. I think if racing ever gets itself into that position, or that perception, then I think at that point we have a problem. So we should always do what we can to accommodate that. That was the other big learning coming out of it. The other thing, as you can see on the screen, we did around this time as well, was after speaking with Surrey Police, who are the local police force at Epsom, and by the way, both police forces, incredibly helpful, and I'll come to that as one of the themes at the end. It became obvious to us that we needed to do something, leave no stone unturned in terms of deterring. So a High Court injunction in the UK is something you can apply for to prevent someone from doing something if it's going to prevent the lawful execution of a peaceful activity, which obviously the running of the Derby is. So after much backwards and forwards with lawyers, KCs and all the rest of it, we were granted a High Court injunction, which basically meant that anyone breaching the track or the racing area at Epsom on Derby Day at any point would be in contempt of court and therefore at risk of going to jail. And there is no doubt at all that costly though it was, that acted as something of a deterrent. Now, we wouldn't do that, we didn't do that willy-nilly. We wouldn't be doing that as a matter of course. We did that for two basic reasons. One, the accessibility and openness of Epsom as a venue, unique. And two, the fact that Animal Rising had been a very public threat against the Derby. I actually think without those two things, there's a good chance that the injunction probably would not have been granted. And that's the advice when I spoke to, obviously, to Ascot and other racecourses and other sports, that was the advice we gave them. Be careful about this because it's expensive and you're not guaranteed it. You need to have a credible threat in front of you to be able to have it granted. Anyway, again, we know what happened on the day. In fact, Winfried had a picture of it up earlier on. We had one person who breached the track. The really good intelligence work from Surrey Police meant that we had over 20 arrests on the morning. That had happened at Aintree as well, but that definitely hollowed out a number of people and therefore some equipment as well. And that, I think, really helped us in the end in terms of containing it. But it didn't change the public discourse in the UK about animal welfare, about horse welfare. But it, as I said earlier, it gave us another chance to be on the front foot around that and to talk about the positive record we've got on that and the improvements we're continuing to make. But it brought home to all of us the need to be relentless on that. We then, looking forward from that, that was obviously, we saw that, I think, as a positive day, I think, given the scenarios we could have been dealing with. We were lucky that the Derby was off as a second race for reasons completely unconnected to Animal Rising, which I won't go into, but it meant it got it out of the way one way or the other early in the day. At that point, it felt like, I guess you could characterize it at that point, we'd won a battle, but we certainly don't feel at this point we've won the war, and I'll come on to that before I finish, because I think the threat is still there. There was a threat around Royal Ascot. We dealt with Ascot very clearly on that. I mean, this is a really good example of the sport working together. In fact, they issued a statement, Animal Rising, saying that we'd been in some way nasty because we didn't want to engage with them in debate anymore. And the CEO of Ascot, who I'm sure many of you know, phoned me up, he said, "Nevin, you're a very nasty man." But that was, that was a good example of where we worked very closely with another racecourse and another big event to sort of help them head off what might have been happening. And in the end, as we all know, Royal Ascot passed off without any real problems. And continuing also to work at that point with other sports as well, because by that point in the UK, we had the Open Golf coming up, we had the Silverstone Grand Prix, Wimbledon was underway, so there were a lot of other threats, not necessarily from Animal Rising, but from their sister organisations and Just Stop Oil. So sharing knowledge and data and experience became a big part of it as well. But I think just moving on to the takeouts, I think this is the biggest one for me. If you look at some of our polling, that's a stark statistic in point 3 there. And this came out as the polling, part of the polling we did as a result of this. 4 in 10 families would not attend live horse racing because of concerns about animal welfare. That is what we're up against, and that was what this gave us a chance to counter in terms of some of the misinformation, because you can guarantee that some of those people answering those questions will be answering it on the basis of information that actually isn't right, but is down to perception. So us being out there on the front foot, talking positively and actually busting some of these myths, I actually saw this as a massive platform, and if this happens again, we will do that again, and we will do it even more effectively next time. And then just looking at some of that in a little bit more detail, and again, picking up on a theme of Natalie's as well, we did a survey of about 1,300 people with our polling people. If you look in the middle there, this shows you, obviously talks to people about concerns in horse welfare. There is a persuadable group in the middle there. Yes, there's 28% who are very concerned about horse welfare and racing, but you've got a group there in, 56% in the middle, who are either quite concerned or not very concerned or have no real view on it. That's your persuadable audience. But if we're going to address that persuadable audience, then we have got to continue to be relentless in all of this, and that was the big learning for us. No change, standing still in this, just not an option, because the public are judging us, the public are watching us, and whilst the majority of people may not agree with the method that Animal Rising were employing, they absolutely agree, many of them, with concerns about welfare around our sport, and that's what we're facing into. So it brought it out to me and to all of us very, very clearly, so it was a really good prism on all of that. And of course, sorry, I should also say here, that persuadable element becomes smaller if you're in the younger age groups. Again, consistent with the data we're seeing from elsewhere. And only, at the top there, 57%, only 57% believe that protests like this are disruptive and unnecessary. I would expect that, I would want that to be higher, because remember, this is unlawful activity we're talking about. So again, I think that tells you something of what we're we're potentially facing into and how we counter that. And that's why getting the communication right and standing up as an industry together is really, really important. And not being scared in some ways. Yes, accommodate them. Yes, win the argument for reasonable opinion, but also don't be scared to call it out as unlawful, because that's exactly what it is. And the large majority of the public would agree with us on that. So right is on our side here, but we've got to make that work for us. So I think the key things for us on the screen there, a lot of these I've already mentioned, but the on-the-ground security contingency planning goes without saying, especially at venues like Epsom. Cooperation of local police, both on the ground and from an intelligence perspective, and the police intelligence, some of which we didn't even know about, and why would they share it with us, was just phenomenal, especially at Epsom. And this, remember, is a massive use of police resource. I mean, I do worry what would have happened on Derby Day if there'd been a big incident of some sort in Woking or Guildford Town Centre, which are other towns in Surrey, because I'm not sure that Surrey Police would have been in a position to deal with that. Communication, not just with the media, not just with the industry, but with the fan base. What's happening? What are we doing about it? But the one theme that works through all of this, as I said, one, being relentless in making sure we do everything we can to be able to talk positively about welfare and what our record is on it, but working together as well and bringing the industry along with us. This was a really good example of where the industry did come together, both behind the scenes and in the media, with some brilliant spokespeople who, to be honest, I mean, in the head-to-head debates, absolutely annihilated animal rising, but people are watching and people want to hear some of those key messages, so in some ways it was a really good platform. So hopefully that's helpful in terms of the background of how we dealt with it, what we had to put up with, the steps we took, and the lessons we took from it as well. I would characterise it as we've quelled the threat for now. We're very pleased to have done so, but there are some very sobering themes in there for us as an industry, and that's why we need to continue to be relentless around what we're doing. Thank you very much for listening.
Second one along, and I'll come and sit down. Are these on? They are. I'm going to come and sit next to you because I don't want to stand up there and talk at you. Seems a bit strange. So I'll let you take this, if I may. Nevin, thank you for that. I found that incredibly interesting. It's an inside look at how you were dealing with a real threat to the fabric of the sport and a massive public order issue as well. Has this been the biggest challenge you've faced in your time as CEO? And there have been a few.
There have been a few. Some of them we talk about, some of them we don't. Yes, without a doubt. I mean, I would say that our social license as a sport was on the line here in some ways because of the spotlight that was shone on it. We talk a lot in these sort of forums and these conferences about the polling data, what it's telling us around Generation Z and so on, but this was it, clear and present right in front of us. So being able to deal with that threat both on the ground and trusting that we've got really good people, fantastic operators who are used to dealing with these sorts of things, but this is something different, and dealing with the police and making sure that the coordination between our people, the security and the police was right. In some ways, from my own point of view, I had to trust people just that was going to be right. Now, I'm lucky to have some of the best operators in the business. So it then became a conversation about, okay, how do we position ourselves here to make sure that as a sport, we're coming across calm, rational. Let's not get into big, ranty debates, because actually that we lose it. Once you do that, you lose the argument.
This is it, and I was quite interested in how you went about positioning yourself, because we warned so many times against racing being used as part of a culture war, and that if you come out very strongly and in a very aggressive way defending your sport, which you're entirely entitled to do, you can then be appropriated by sort of anti-animal rights extremists on the other end of the political spectrum, and then you risk alienating people.
I was really, tempting though it was, I was really, really keen that we did not get into that sort of tit-for-tat debate. One well-known breakfast radio presenter volunteered to don a high-vis yellow vest and sort out the protesters herself. I resisted that question and said, we've got to let the police do their job. we've got to make sure that we're seen to be doing right, and we've got to stay on the right side of this. If someone landed from Mars and had no view on this, was completely neutral, would they back the person who was coming across as calm, rational, reasonable, including providing places for peaceful protest, or would they back the person who has some slightly far out ideas, not far out to some, but far out to many, and who is putting forward some pretty difficult to accept arguments and breaking the law at the same time? So that was where we wanted to make sure we positioned ourselves, and that was key for us.
To what extent were you conscious, and you did touch on this in your speech, but to what extent were you conscious of some of the themes that we were picking up earlier in the day about people who are antagonistic or even have antipathy towards horse racing now being part of a more mainstream conversation? You can't simply consign them to a marginal position or an extreme marginal position.
Well, you can't, and the statistics bear that out. And that's where, especially among younger people, so that's why you've got to be clear on the steps you are taking and how you go about, to be honest, busting some myths. Because a lot of that agenda feeds off misinformation. So being able to say, yes, this opinion might be becoming mainstream, but actually, come and see a yard, come and see how well looked after these horses are. I had emails, I know Julie had too, and their team, I had emails from lots of jumps and flat trainers saying, my yard's open any time. And indeed, we now have a former animal rising person who has bought into a share on a horse with a Group 1 winning trainer.
You are quite convinced that this animal rising person is not just a snout?
Well, who knows?
Well converted, if that's the case, anyway. How do you go about creating a race day that is still welcoming to all, whilst making it as secure as you possibly can?
Yeah, that's a big balance, because one of our big themes is showing that racing is a welcoming, open, inclusive sport, and clearly having significant numbers of uniformed police and security around the place is not necessarily amenable to that. The one thing in our favour was, at least in the build-up to Aintree and Epsom, because it had been so well publicised of what might happen, I think the most spectators coming in to enjoy the day would probably have expected to see what was going on. The challenge comes for us this incoming season, when we need to be prepared for this potentially to happen again. Therefore, we do need more of a security presence, but we need to balance that, as you say, with the fact that we don't want people to feel that it's an unwelcome experience. So it needs to be quite low profile.
Okay, to what extent then are you having to build that into your budget? Because this is extremely expensive. Yeah, this costs you hundreds of thousands of pounds extra.
I didn't touch on that. This is, excluding the injunction across Aintree and Epsom, there wouldn't be, in terms of additional costs, there wouldn't be much change left out of 250 grand. And that's quite material to us as a business. So that means we're having, as you say, we're having to build that in next year, which then impacts for us on the rest of our business, the rest of our investment model.
James Gibbons said a little earlier on that jump racing accounts for 35% of the fixture list in the UK. The Jockey Club are the custodians of Cheltenham and of Aintree, two of the most famous jumps race courses anywhere in the world. The Grand National is one of the most famous horse races in the world and one of the most celebrated as well. You sit here today in front of an international audience, many of whom have limited interest in jump racing. How can you imagine its future as you sit here today, given what we've just been talking about?
Yeah, I think the future of jump racing is contingent on how we change it and we evolve it to respond to changing societal trends. We have to accept as a sport that we've got to be relentless in continuing to make it safer and to tell that story, because there is a persuadable public there. The stats show us that, but that will only work for us if we're clear on the changes we're making, we're intentional in making those changes, and we actually then have stuff to back up what we're saying.
But the point that V was making earlier on, and we had a little bit of a chat in the interval, and I said I would ask you, and this leads neatly onto it, is where do you stop changing? Where do you stop changing?
Yeah, because you've got to balance it with the competitiveness, effectively the jeopardy of the sport, and every single change you make, you have to look through it under that lens. So I personally think that you probably never stop having to change something, but you've got to make sure that you keep the jeopardy of a certain race at the right level, and that line may change over time. But if you are going to have competitive, compelling jumps racing that people want to watch in 15, 20, 30 years' time, then I think we've got to continue on that journey.
So you believe it's possible to stay ahead of the curve of public opinion, but at the same time, not completely do away with the essence of the sport?
I think that's the balance we have. That's our challenge. I think that's the balance we have to strike.
And you think it's possible with jump racing?
I think it's possible.
Even with a race?
If I didn't think it was possible, I wouldn't be doing this job. But that's our challenge as a sport.
Even with a race like the Grand National?
Even with a race like the Grand National.
Just overall, Nevin, I mean, how long have you been CEO now of the Jockey?
Just over 3 years.
I mean, it must seem like about 30, doesn't it?
It's been a lot of fun. No, it's been. I mean, look, we had a tough time during COVID, obviously, as everyone did in this room in many different ways. We obviously had some interesting reputational PR issues when I first took the job, which were thankfully are behind us now. And then obviously we've had what's happened this year that we've just been talking about. But look, we love challenges. It'd be boring otherwise. And that's why we love this great sport, because we want to evolve it, invest in it, and make it better. And that's what I'm here to do.
Nevin Truesdale, ladies and gentlemen. Let's give Nevin a round of applause. Has anybody got any questions before we bring up our final speaker today? Any questions for Nevin? There is. I think Scott's got his hand up at the back. Is it a donut-related question, Scott?
I promise there's no donuts.
I think it was Scott who broke the news about the donuts as well, wasn't it?
Absolutely wasn't me.
Jonathan Harding, then.
Just on the animal rising front, obviously they made a decision that to maximise their profile, they were going to advertise what they were doing in advance. And I know you said that in terms of what happened at Aintree, you had some intelligence from Merseyside Police, but how much of a danger is either a resurgence of animal rising or a like-minded fellow traveller group that decides that they're not going to tell you what they're doing beforehand and they just show up on the day and they're better organised?
I think that we have to always be prepared for that possibility, Scott. I think it's a great question, by the way, and we have to be prepared for that possibility from now on. We went to a meeting, a number of sports went to a meeting with the UK Home Secretary in July, and we had some very senior Metropolitan Police officers at that meeting. So this was obviously after the Derby and after Royal Ascot. And the intelligence from those police officers was that whilst the threat was very much still there, the numbers of people had significantly diminished. There is scope for that to reverse. So this coming jump season and well through it and beyond, we need to be ready for those threats. And as you say, for a threat that isn't sort of telexed to us in advance. I'm not quite sure why they decided to do that, but they did, and it did help us. But it's something that we don't think has gone away, and I think all racing operators, certainly in the UK and probably Ireland as well, need to be ready for.
Any other questions for Nevin? No? None at all? I thought Brian was about to put his hand up there, but not to be. Okay. Nevin, thank you very much.
Thank you, Nick.
Safe travels home.
Yeah, thanks.
And our final speaker, ladies and gentlemen. Nevin's been talking about how you deal with a crisis, how you face a crisis, an existential crisis in truth, when it comes to protecting two of your crown jewels, the Grand National and the Derby, and they are issues that we're going to face more and more as a sport globally with the societal challenges that we've been talking about. Our final speaker excels at using research-based insights to message, position, to manage crises for all sorts of industries, government, healthcare, advocacy clients, and he is going to tell you exactly how he does that and how that could be applicable to horse racing and a situation like this. And indeed, his clients have included the Jockey Club, about whom we have just been hearing. So please welcome our final speaker today, the Principal of Pierpont Consulting and Analytics, or Master of the Dark Arts, Mr. Robert Green.
Where do I press this? I wonder if I shouldn't go over there. Yeah.
As you like. As you like. We got that.
Oh, look, let me compliment first Nevin. It's tough. And, it's tough to know what the appropriate action is. And so often when we've worked in situations like this, using data, we've had situations where we had to make decisions very much like Nevin did. We've seen some of this now in the U.S., on the U.S. Open, the tennis, similar type protests, disrupted activities for half an hour there. It wouldn't shock any of us if this becomes more common in the States. Look, what I'd like to do now, oh, it's already up. Look, oh, well, this worked well. Am I doing that? I'm so sorry. Let me go back. Ah, there we are. Look, we've already talked a little bit about this. I absolutely have worked with the Jockey Club. But I do want to make one distinction quickly before we move on. I'm the only speaker you've heard today who absolutely is not an expert on equine health, on regulation in horse racing, who brings a background in veterinarian science, aside from anything else. What I am, for lack of a better term, is a data-based perception expert. Data-based perception expert. So, well, the reality is that perception and reality are not really the same thing. They tend to ride together, but not always. So what we try to do very hard is have the most accurate possible data about perceptions by way of shaping future realities, for lack of a better phrase. In crisis management, we certainly measure. We probe, we pressure, we best test what people, using opinion research tools and techniques, we do our very best to find out exactly what we're facing, what the situation is. I want to emphasize something, and I noticed this basically not only in the polling just shared, but also some of the things that were in our morning session, that it's really hard to get the right audience. I'll just leave it at that. Knowing exactly who your stakeholders are and then actually getting trustworthy research. And by that I mean typically research where we have enough numbers that we can project against a population. It's pretty tough work. Typically we don't poll the public. Examples of audiences we often survey, and I'm speaking now far beyond the work, though this encompasses a lot of work to some degree we did with the Jockey Club in the United States. But in many crisis management situations, we're looking not only, of course, at basically industry players, and we've done a lot of research among those audiences in the US and for TJC, but we often talk in crisis management or crisis situations to financial analysts, corporate executives, think tank or university experts. In other words, those are people that are particularly influential, they matter, depends again on the problem and the exact situation. Interestingly, when I do the public in the United States at least, it is true that sometimes, even often in crisis management situations, we survey voters. But as we say up here, really in the United States at least, that's a pretty select audience. Only about half of adults vote. In most of the other democracies in the world, the number of people that vote are pretty close to the actual adult population. So let's go forward. Oh, there we go, good. Look, when I do voters, and I have looked at this, and I mean, this is what I'm really struck by at the point we're at, and particularly after hearing all of today's presentations. When we look at voters, many times it's because of, as I said, it's only about half of adult Americans. So at least in the United States, it's a pretty select crowd. That's kind of what we're saying in the first bullet. But what is really critical here, and it's very critical when political decisions get made, and in situations like what led to IFHA in the United States, it's that we want the feedback, ideally, to be good. between, if you would, the voters and the politicians. Over time, successful politicians are successful precisely because they get the feedback. That doesn't mean they all act the same way. It certainly doesn't mean that they're all reasonable people, but it does mean that it is important, if we have something useful to say, it's important that we convey that and that, in essence, whatever our stakeholder groups are, as I said earlier, hard sometimes to define, it's important if those groups, in essence, provide the feedback that we want, in particular, the politicians to get. Look, surveying the right audience as well as accurate measurement is necessary, but it's not sufficient. And I'll make that point now. There's a whole science to persuasion. Maybe this is, I don't really think of it as the dark arts at all, actually, but that's, I mean, it's flattering in a way when people say that, because it always has that, is there some wizard aspect to this? Well, there really isn't, but it does mean it's thorough in a way that is a little different, perhaps. I often start at the kind of research that Natalie brought up, that Nevin brought up. That is incredibly important. You could think of that almost as, if I can use this phrase, market research. The market, it matters to know exactly where you start in the situation. But honestly, a lot of what we do is where this is the second bullet, it's testing all different ways that you can talk about your issue or about your concern or your problem. It is the science of persuasion, as I say, but there's really a business of, literally, as I say here, dozens of phrases, supporting arguments. Look, what I'm trying to suggest here is if you want a better future, maybe you need to go create it. If you want a better future, maybe you need to go create it. Now, nothing changes, and everything I've learned today underscores how seriously everyone in this room takes, if you would, dealing with issues in the industry and making sure that we're foursquare champions for equine welfare, if I could use those words used so much today. But all those things matter, but it does matter because there are better and worse ways to tell your story. So a lot of the science of persuasion is, what words do I use? What arguments really connect with people? And again, incredibly important that they be the right stakeholders and not necessarily the general public. As I said, if we're doing voters, it's because there's a specific feedback thing we want to do. But it's sometimes what we do, and that's the third bullet down, is literally something called combat testing. I might oppose what Animal Rights Rising is doing, and I'm just taking that obviously from the UK. That group, so far as I know, does not exist, at least under that name in the US. But I might actually oppose the most rational possible, most effective possible version of their message against what we heard today in this room, and try variations. Again, all of this is about we have to do real things in the real world, but how do we frame it? How do we tell the story in ways that make what we do more effective, gives better feedback to the politicians that we wouldn't have otherwise? Let me tell you some brief stories. We're actually pretty close to this brief presentation, which is probably useful because I know the heat is killing about half the room. The first two I'm intently involved with in the morning. The second two are old war stories, but they're probably familiar to most everybody in this room, just because they like some of the crazier things that happen in the United States. This story went worldwide. At the moment, I'm doing all sorts of messaging around the issue of credit card fees, which might look really boring to everybody, but those of you that are in business may know that 2 to 3% in the United States of everything you purchase, no matter what method you use to purchase it, payment, in other words, check, card, Apple Pay, whatever, almost 3% of it goes in essence to the banks and the credit card industry, largely Visa and MasterCard. And the United States, unlike most other countries in the world, among the democracies, developed in democracies, in the United States, the fees are 6 or 7 times what they are in Europe. Maybe some people estimate more like 7 or 8. So what happened yesterday? Right after I got back, completely true story, right after I got back from the races, all of a sudden a text came in from an old business associate, and he said, "What's the other side doing advertising on the football games, American football games that were playing yesterday in the United States. So, look, I'm representing the merchant side of a big issue, and in a crisis management situation, or communications challenge in any case, except I think it is becoming, if you would, moving into new territory. And the other side would, in fact, be the credit card companies and the banks. And these people all work together amicably on all sorts of issues. But on the question of fees, not surprisingly, it's very divisive. And so basically, when I heard yesterday that the other side was now advertising on national TV on football games reaching well over 100 million Americans, because that's pretty much the only thing everybody watches now in the United States, or one of the few things. When I heard this, I thought, this thing has moved from being in the Washington Zoo to, and I was struck by, she's not here now, but now it's moved from the Washington Zoo to the American three-ring circus. I mean, advertising at that level in the United States on just another issue before Congress, this is akin to what happens in our presidential campaigns. I mean, this is heavy-duty spending. So what's my first piece of advice? Do not trust your, here it is. Based on the crisis situation, the one I'm living basically every business day and sometimes on the weekends, it is my first piece of advice about, if you would, this kind of communications is do not trust your judgment, trust your data. I don't know what's going on, and I do know that if I think about the fact that the other side is now spending literally daily tens of millions of dollars, I'd be more worried about it, except that I know that my data might find out it doesn't really matter that much. I don't know yet. We'll find out later. On pharma COVID, this was interesting. That's the trade group representing the America's biopharmaceutical companies. It's a pretty big group in the United States, as I'm sure all of you know. The long and the short of it is I basically, using data, at the very beginning of COVID, we discovered that the world was very different about attitudes toward pharmaceutical companies. In the United States, there's a fair amount of negativity around pharmaceutical companies. And then all of a sudden COVID hit. Now remember, you have to go back 3.5 years now and remember what, as all of us do, our feelings the first few weeks, which were pretty traumatic. But basically, this is where I learned lesson number 2. Again, here's where the data taught me something that my judgment would not necessarily have understood. And that is that sometimes reality is so amazing, it completely overcomes perception. Look, most of the time I'm doing the science of perception. Perception has an imperfect relationship to reality. But sometimes reality is so big, like at a time like March 2020 across all our countries, that it overwhelms. And that taught us that we needed to talk very differently. It was no longer important, very differently about, if you would, pharma as an industry, that it was important to hit notes nobody had ever hit before. And in essence, embrace the science and what they were up to. So that's where we got that one. On the last two, look, these were not, I wasn't in any sense the chief guy, my firm. I certainly was acquainted with the data. But, and I'm talking about Martha Stewart, a name I'm sure most of you know, and another name, Bill Clinton, that everybody knows. But both these stories now are well over 20 years old. Let's just go to the main event and Rule 3 when we talk about these two. And that is, you heard Rule 1, trust your data more than your judgment, particularly in emergency situations. And if Rule 2 is, sometimes reality is so real it overcomes perceptions of long-standing. Rule 3 is, and you've all seen it on the posters, keep calm and carry on. We all saw that. We owe that to the British. We now use it everywhere, all over the world, I'm sure. We certainly use it a lot in the United States. Keep calm and carry on. A lot of what we learned from the data in those situations, and again, I was very much in a secondary subsidiary role, but I was acquainted with the data, was just that stay after what you're doing, do it right, and that lots of times your worst fears, the headline you saw the next day, not a problem, not a problem. They weren't, in essence, the audiences you cared about the most, which in the case of those two weren't solely the general public, certainly in Martha Stewart's case in particular, but these things were not necessarily causing the trouble that you might have thought. Look, opinion data of the kind I do, it's just one more kind of data. One thing, I got such a kick out of hearing everything today, but the biometric, how important that is. But this is one more stream of data that you use when you're in a community. The comparison is you're very proactively seeking out ways to improve the health of horses, and that's a wonderful thing. What I'm saying is in the situation we find ourselves, which was so dramatically and perfectly put by Nevin, in that situation, it's also useful to understand how perceptions are with exactly the audiences you care about, which may not be actually the general public in terms of horse racing. Certainly involves all sorts of people that we've surveyed on behalf of TJC in the past, but it is among those audiences that you need to have data. It needs to be fresh. It needs to come along every so often. It doesn't have to be every week or anything, but you need to understand what are they processing, what are they thinking, and is the feedback that in particular political leaders in countries like the United States are getting, is it the kind of feedback you would hope? Is there a story out there that you are making progress, that these problems are going to get better, and to some degree, the public need not worry about them anymore? And this, in particular in the American situation, given, frankly, not the best situations at the tracks earlier this year, I think this is particularly important, but I assume there's some applicability in other countries as well, based on what I heard today. And with that, I say thank you. Do you want me to? I'm sorry, do I?
Thank you very much.
Yeah,
let's take a
Okay.
seat. I felt it was rather appropriate, Rob, that you ended much as we began this, which was the line, don't trust your judgment, trust your data. And that's pretty well where we started this whole conference today with what Natalie was saying. Yes, be alive to the emotional aspects of this sport, but realize what informs you in your decisions.
Well, and also look very hard at how you tell your story better, because that's really what guys like us do more than anything else. It is built on what think of it as the proper, let me just call it market research. You need the data we saw today, for the public opinion data. We saw a lot of impressive data today. And that was very good stuff that both Nevin and Natalie shared. But I am suggesting that you also should use this process and some of the techniques I showed on the science of persuasion slide to basically create a better. Now, there has to be reality behind things. This isn't just in the world of perception. This isn't just no matter what you've done, the public's going to buy it. But assuming that you're doing exactly what I heard today over the course of this meeting, and you should think very hard and use data to teach you how to tell that story in a better way.
How well do you think racing is telling its story? And I'm not talking about a seminar like this. I'm talking about day-to-day to the wider public.
Well, I mean, we saw in Natalie's numbers some progress, at least with stakeholders. So one reason I had a slide up about getting the right kind of audience is it's tough. I said it was tough. It is tough. In other words, exactly who is it? At the moment, the audience that's the most important are a few rings out from everyone in this room. It is people in, yes. If I'm being clear, and I appreciate this is being given in different languages, so I'm hopeful I'm being clear. But it is those audiences defining exactly who those people are inside your particular nations is very important.
And how do you go about doing that?
Well, that's a lot of, that's where my expertise is useful. Honestly, a lot of it is, it's a lot about the people, literally the firms you use to conduct the research. You have to get in the middle of exactly what they're doing, who they're talking to. Sometimes, I mean, some of it is, it's like anything else. You spend a lot of time, you invest a lot of time confirming that they are, I don't mean to suggest they're trying to do bad work or lie to you, but it's like a lot of things in life. You just, trust but verify. There's a lot of trust but verify. That's very much in the weeds of polling. Beyond that, it is, I think you have to have a clear idea of, and those are things like sample and quality of the sample. But beyond that, I think it's just very important that you need to spend a lot of time with experts. This is where I have to typically spend much more time with people like you, learning how I write questionnaires. Now, it's a collaborative process. Let me be very clear. There's no like, this guy writes the questionnaire, and we just have to accept it. But you have to think very hard about other people's problems and challenges and get your language right. One thing I really care about enormously, this came up actually in terms of somebody asked Natalie, you getting exactly the language that's the closest approximation to capturing what's actually going on, because words are imperfect. All of them are imperfect, and all of them have biases. But if you think really hard about it, there are better ways to explore issues of importance. And a lot of it is you have to learn all about your clients' challenges.
Which is the industry that you've worked with so far that has been the most difficult, the most challenging, of all the industries you've worked across?
I don't know. They all had problems. Well, I'm going to reverse that one. I'll go back to the credit card. We did, in fact, get something passed on debit cards, which are also huge huge everywhere.
Yep.
And I mean, I was pleased when I saw that, like, the New York Times said this was the one thing we never expected to see out of financial reform in the United States, simply because I don't want to. It's not hard to beat the banks. It's not easy to beat the banks. Excuse me, I said that exactly wrong. It's not easy to beat the banks. Sorry.
It's all about the words.
Yes, and I got completely reversed it. It's hard to beat the banks. It's hard to beat the credit card companies. And I'm not. Look, I've worked very well with some of the people that were on that issue. We've all worked together well. I mean, I'm with retailers on this one. It's not like these people are not mortal. It's not Trump versus whoever. It's this is, people work together amicably on all sorts of issues. But, it's like the jockeys you were talking about earlier. They're your friends until they're not. And they're not when you're on the track. And we're on the track on that one.
It'll be fascinating to know how you can really help racing move in the right direction in terms of communicating its message. Does anybody have any questions for Rob Green? Yes, Jim Galliano is here and needs a...
I think we need to have a, some of the words are...
Could you hear that at the back or not? No, Jim, can you repeat it with the mic?
Sure. Sorry about that. From your time here today, what are some of the terms or phrases or words that you would seek to test to see if they would be effective with audiences? Now, of course, you still have to do your research, but what comes to mind for you today of some of the phrases that might be helpful to all of us as we think about presenting ourselves to those concentric circles that are outside this room? Yes.
I mean, this is because the data was summarized, this may have been done. But on TAC and equipment, I would want to understand that I think you need very specific understanding, certainly around crops, obviously, and crop use. But what I would do is break down also the issues that were sort of summarized in some of the data. You need to break those down into different pieces. And I think, you also need to understand, I'm sorry, and I don't mean you out there need to understand. I'm talking about me and what, when I look at language and I look at impact, there are some things that are incredibly, this is where perception and reality vary, Jim. There's some things that we all know are enormously important for equine health are relatively less interesting to these concentric circles outside us. So I would want to have a very firm understanding of why I might feature things that are in some respects less important to the insiders than other things. And So in essence, to answer it fully, I would break down every single piece of this first and foremost into different, if you would, component parts. And I would also, and sometimes you have to do this iteratively. You learn things in the first, you can't learn it all at one time. You do it a second time. And out of that process, you kind of learn, you really do learn, actually, that some things have a much more emotional impact with some audiences than they would with everybody in this room. So I think that would be one lesson. And then finally, I would actually, it's always interesting, what should you be talking about that no matter what the other side says, they hear you? This builds on the reasonableness that Nevin was talking about. There, you can sound, or to run with it, you can even be more reasonable than what was already clearly reasonable. You just have to figure out what that is.
Yes, we got a question right up the front here, Andrew. There we go.
Thanks, Nick. Andrew Harding from the International Federation of the Hong Kong Jockey Club. I'm sorry if this is taking a bit further from your area of expertise, but if you've identified what are the key phrases, the things that you want to employ, that you want to use to engage and shape perception, assuming the reality is good, what are the most effective means? If you don't have the tens of millions a day to spend like the banks do, what are because this is part of the challenge we face, how do you, once you've identified the good messages, the right words to use to connect with the audience, what are the most, now, in this sort of vastly changed media environment, what are the best means of doing that?
Every damn day as quickly as possible. I'm quite serious. You can, over time, earn your way into their heads. You can't do it, you're not going to be able to do it by running ads during American NFL football games. We all understand that. Anyway, that illustrated the lesson of, I need data to see if any of that's working for the other side. They're spending millions. Many times, and this is good news, often they spend millions and it's useless. Often, different kind of audience, completely animal rising, throws major protests, and all they've done is irritate all the reasonable people. So the good news, I think, in this for us is once we have a course of action, it is being relentless about doing it over and over again until you're bored with it yourself. But keep doing it. It needs to be based, as I said, on a reality. I heard the reality in the room today about the things that are happening very quickly. But yes, you need to tell that story, and the sooner the better. And particularly in the context of the United States, we need that among the stakeholders to make certain, in particular, the Congress and the politicians don't do something that we wouldn't want.
Thank you, Andrew. V.
Thank you, Nick. Robert, just to clarify, I noticed on your slides you stated that obviously data is important and you make decisions on data rather than perception, so that's cool.
Well, data on perception.
On perception, correct.
Yeah.
But on your slides, what I need clarity, you say you basically have a specific target market, industry players, financial analysts, corporate executives. Now, that will fail the test when you're looking at the animal rising group because your slides clearly state that you don't poll the public. Now, that could be slightly conflicting in our environment. I need clarity on that because you say you don't poll the public. Now, that concerns me.
Yeah, you're making a lot of, I mean, I decided to check. I wasn't certain if it was Britney Spears or Taylor Swift who said haters gonna hate. Okay, it was Britney. It was Swift. It was Taylor Swift. So I don't know that I would polling the public to find the 40 people that actually finally showed up to the demonstration at Epsom. I can't find them. It's a needle in a hay. I'm sort of answering your question, but I'll get it. What I'm saying is I'm not saying that if there was endless time and resource, I'm not against polling the public, and pollsters love that because they have lots of data on the public and they can compare things. In your situation, it strikes me, make sure you have the right stakeholder audiences and they matter the most. And find out who those are, or define them really well, and a lot of your analysis should be based on them. In the context of just the United States, The voters are a more select group of adults than they are in most other countries where almost everybody votes. So then among voters, I'm very keen, for instance, on voters that we know are actually interested, ideally bet, in horse racing. So that, so I spend that would be part of what we want to do. But I don't know if I can ever poll, or if it's much use to us to poll haters that are going to hate anyway. I think what's better is, how do we understand, how to create an environment, and that's what I'm talking about feedback and about, just do it hard and as fast as you can. And over time you can win, you just can't probably do it in a week or a year even. But do those things, and that's the best way to counter those people. Then those people often go bug somebody else. Maybe, people who, milk cows or something. I'm sorry, I don't mean to be dismissive, but there's a lot of fad and fashion in protests, and ideally they'll move on to something else if we create an environment where they can't get much out of us.
Yes, Natalie.
Thanks, Robert, and great talk. I'm just interested, not so much in the what is said, so the messaging, but the messenger. And I wanted to have you comment a little bit around the science of persuasion in relation to who's the credible person to speak. Because one of the things that we found, certainly with the data that we've collected for the FEI, has been that they have a lot of stakeholders within the industry have a suspicion anyway about what goes on behind closed doors and are disappointed by the lack of progress. So they're looking for proactivity, not reactivity. But they're also looking for credible people to talk. And I'm interested in some of the experience that you've had around, is industry itself the right voice, or is it industry that drives and supports the messaging, but it's actually other influencers that are likely to make bigger strides in terms of the messaging?
Every question I've gotten was great, but I'd have to say yours was the best. That's the missing slide. That's the one I should have done. What I heard today felt like we're short on the right messengers. And I would use these same techniques and explore that. It's so funny, I have a friend whose daughter, this is someone who's like, whenever Microsoft has a massive problem, this woman goes and deals with it. She and I worked together at my old firm. Her daughter was in dressage, and I had no idea how many celebrity kids. I was aware of Springsteen's daughter. Turns out Bill Gates. So I'm really, to answer very specifically, and I brought that up for a reason. And she gave me. I asked her just when I said, "What about Springs?" And he said she was a great writer. She's very up on all the celebrity kids in writing, because a lot of them are brilliant at that. But my point, it didn't have any connection to politics as much as it's just something I knew she'd know something about, so I asked her. So what's the point? The point is what I took away from this morning's meeting is, one, message development is an important part of what you need to do, and I'm not sure you're in the best position right now. Two, what often is important is to use some figure outside of your immediate circles who has some credibility. Believe me, I'm at least as suspicious of anybody in this room of celebrity endorsement, but I'm at least interested in that and what potentially could be done with that. And certainly there are some celebrities who are, of course, keenly devoted to flats, to thoroughbred horse racing. And so that's something to look at as well. What I remember from our time on IFHA was we had some celebrities, but I don't know that was everything we needed, or if you would, frankly, the right ones. And I'm sorry I hope this isn't just remembered as find a celebrity. I don't really mean that. Ideally, there'd be some work that someone who has credentials, like many of you in this room, could be an important part of telling the story. But how you get there is a process.
Sadly, Taylor Swift is not one of them.
No.
Do we have time for one final question? I don't want to put any pressure on, but make it a good one. Is there one more? There is not. I think that brings us to a close. Rob Green, fascinating. I've learned so much today. Thank you so much. Rob Green, ladies and gentlemen. Wow, we have covered a lot of ground, and you have been a wonderful, patient, attentive audience. And you're all looking remarkably cool as well, given the fact that we're now approaching greenhouse proportions in here. Thank you to all our speakers today, from Natalie to Robert, through everybody else who has contributed. You have done so much for our better understanding, not only of the sport, but most importantly, of how better we look after our great equine heroes. For a concluding word, I'm looking around for our chair, and he's here. Winfried Engelbeck-Breskus, please take us out on a high.
So I think obviously the bar to take you up on a high is pretty high. So what I try to do is to be very short in a way, and then end up with a high, which is probably one of always a highlight of the conference. That is the Arc de Triomphe itself, and especially if you see a wonderful performance. But again, I would like to thank you for attending this 57th International Conference. And I only can say it, at least from my point of view, it was the most productive and informative day. Together we have explored in great depth the single most critical issue which is facing our sport and what we can do to better safeguard our horses. I personally see really great opportunities. I feel hopefully energized that you see this the same. And I think that we have heard many innovative ideas, initiatives. We have seen great collaboration. And I personally think that is a wonderful start for going deeper into this topic, which I conclude that everybody in the room feels is our number one topic we have to address. I want to thank, first of all, before we go in a little summarizing the conference, I want to thank Nick for so skillfully moderating the conference through the day, and to all our translators who have helped everyone from around the world to stay connected, because I think it's live streamed, and I get some reactions from around the world which are extremely positive. Again, thank you very much. I would like to thank especially and convey our gratitudes to our team in the IFHA Executive Office for organizing such a great event and ensuring the seamless transition from our previous conference home on France Galop to, in a way, I would probably say our new home, the Saint-Cloud Racecourse. Thank you, Andrew, and the team, especially Andrew Chesser, because we have two Andrews. It's always Andrew Harding and Andrew Chesser, so Andrew H and Andrew C, so that we are very precise. And from the Jockey Club, the team of Shannon and Amanda, Henri Poré, France Galop and Priscille and Julie, James Ogilvy and the team from the Hong Kong Jockey Club, especially Matt, Iris, Jerry and Adrian. And I would like to thank you that we did today the climate test, and obviously the stamina and interest is great, and the adaptability and agility that you move around the room in a way to avoid, here comes the sun. And it shows obviously that there's a huge interest. But I hope in a way that you leave this conference feeling better informed to what you heard, the exchanges with your peers, yet you treasured these, and what is most important, that you're determined to work together to ensure the sustainability of our sport. Because I can only say that from all the side discussions, it seems that we connect again in person, which I think is extremely important to address these key issues. On that note, I would like to take just a few minutes before we go to the video of the Arc de Triomphe to summarize the major themes we have explored and what are the next steps we plan in the Federation. Because these are the key driving forces, we think, for our work and the strategic objectives and initiatives we want to undertake in the coming year. Firstly, we have clearly established that we are in a very rapidly changing environment and that the society changes will, in a way, not only force us that this is an opportunity for us to address issues we have identified. We see that the expectations on the racing industry through this changing environment, and moreover, the increasing changing environment, are significant. We took deliberately a little bit maybe controversial outside view, which I think Ned provided, because I think it is important sometimes that we are not only looking inside what we do as an industry. I personally think it's very important that we sometimes take an outside perspective to really see and test what we have done. And we have done a lot. And we have, if you look at the presentation, we have put always horse welfare first. And we have made tremendous progress in the last years. But it is still, in a way, an issue which we, in a way, have to do more. And we have to examine and assess, are we at a tipping point, and how we can avoid this tipping point. So we must accelerate our activities to address these issues. And I would like to suggest that we really, in a way, systematically work through the issues, and especially comes to the issue of communication. Because we do a lot, but we had discussions on multiple fronts that we, in our communication, has to have a little bit more proactive and strategic approach. So what is important for us that looking at horse welfare from birth, training, racing and retirement and aftercare, that we have to be even better equipped to address animal welfare issues and welfare issues, and that traceability of horses is one of the key issues we always had as a key focus, but we have to do even more, and there were very good suggestions what we can do more even to enhance this and how we can collaborate even better together. We think it is important that we have to strengthen the collaboration not only within the racing authorities globally, but I think that we have to be even more aware of racing restrictions and retirements we should enforce globally, and not in a way that a horse is not permitted in one jurisdiction and is permitted in another jurisdiction, which I think will definitely create animal welfare. The industry must also enable a greater transparency, and what we discussed, communicate more proactively to address the concerns about the other 23 hours. The Federation will actively assist through the production and promotion of videos to demonstrate its good welfare practices and deliver a good life for its horses. But what was very interesting to see what is the audience and how we have to shape the messages for the audience. It's also clear that much is being done to invest in research and technology to minimize horse injuries, but particularly catastrophic breakdowns and sudden death. We must also invest in people to build capacity and capability, because this is most important, especially when it comes to upcoming racing jurisdictions, or not as racing jurisdictions who are not as well equipped as some of the big five. Further, we need to enhance our collaboration and coordination efforts, including with organizations like IFHA that are bringing new ideas and initiatives to bear. The Federation provides a vital network for pooling efforts to share research and data, so collectively we can really work much better together and process to convert what best practices is and share them. The Executive Office will again, together with global experts, facilitate a welfare summit in the first half of 2024 to further this critical work. Finally, we undertook a thorough examination of the ever-increasing importance of public engagement, organizational response, and industry communication that can play a major effort in dealing with this, not just equine welfare issues, but the promotion of the sport as a whole. It is vital that we heed these lessons in our daily lives as racing custodians. The perception of our sport by our participants, our wider stakeholder groups, including sponsors and the community at large, will go a long way to determine racing's long-term sustainability. Once again, it has been a great pleasure to see you all here in Paris and be part of stimulating discussions that have taken place today. I look forward to staying connected with you until the next international conference, so I do hope that before then, I will see you on multiple other occasions in one of the big race meetings, but last not least, as a last advertising in the 40th Asian Racing Conference in Sapporo next August. To close, I would like to continue the tradition of the Federation to show the video of the ARC, which our chair emeritus, Louis, always enjoyed. Unfortunately, Louis cannot be here with us, but I think he would be proud when he sees what he has achieved as legacy and how we have kept the tradition working together for the benefit of the sport. In this respect, I would like that we show the video, and after this, I would like to wish you a wonderful evening. Enjoy the evening, and then see you for dinner. Thank you.
La plus belle course du monde, l'Arc de Triomphe, le Qatar Prix de l'Arc de Triomphe, 2400 mètres à parcourir. C'est S-Impact qui est invaincu, qui est le favori. S-Impact qui a été repris par Christian Demuro, qui se retrouve à l'arrière-garde d'un peloton qui est emmené par Bay Bridge avec Westover qui vient en 2-3e position côté corde. Sim Camille qui se rapproche, lui qui s'est lancé à l'extérieur avec Mr Hollywood qui vient en 2-3e position. Ockham qui se retrouve à flanc de peloton, place du Carousel. Ayazar qui sont au milieu d'ailleurs du peloton avec Freewin qui vient côté corde. La concurrente japonaise 76 qui pour le moment galope à l'arrière-garde avec le favori S-Impact qui est en antépénultième position. Onesto est avant-dernier, c'est un cheval allemand, le numéro 1 Isfahan, qui pour le moment ferme la marche.
Ils sont passés derrière le petit bois avec toujours Mr Hollywood qui mène devant Bay Bridge, comme à l'extérieur, Sim Camille, les 4e, Westover est à la corde avec Fit the Flame qui a une très bonne course, place du Carousel à l'extérieur, Freewind galopant à l'intérieur devant le 2, Ayazar que devant Continuous ainsi que le 14, Fantastic Moon à l'arrière, le 9, Fruit Heaven 6 devant le grand favori, c'était Ace Impact à l'arrière, 6 Faron ou encore Onesto, le 3.
La descente à présent avec le toujours recommande ce Qatar Prix de l'Arc de Triomphe, le numéro 11 de Mr Hollywood. Ockham qui vient à son extérieur. Bay Bridge est en 3e position côté corde. Westover a pour le moment un bon parcours. 4e, flancation en extérieur de Sim Camille. Place du Carousel, Fil de Flemme venant un petit peu plus loin avec Freewind qui chemine côté corde. Nous avons Ayazar qui vient un peu plus loin en compagnie de Continuous, le numéro 14 Fantastic Moon qui patiente à l'arrière-garde. Il est suivi par le favori S-Impact. True 76 venant ensuite toujours les deux mêmes aux 2 dernières places. Onesto et Sisfahan.
La fausse ligne droite, Mr Hollywood, comme avec Bay Bridge dans cet ordre, Sim Camille, les 4e, Westover et 5e, place du Carousel vient en dehors devant Fit the Flame, avec ensuite le 10, Freewind, accompagné encore par le numéro 14, Fantastic Moon.
Le début de la ligne droite avec Mr Hollywood qui est toujours le meilleur. Ockham qui vient l'attaquer, Bay Bridge qui cherche l'ouverture, mais il y a l'open stretch maintenant avec à l'extérieur Sim Camille qui tente de venir à Impact tout à l'extérieur qui tente de progresser en compagnie d'un autre 3 ans, Fantastic Moon.
Avec le pool qui est là, Westover qui passe à l'attaque accompagné à son extérieur par Sim Camille. Et puis voilà maintenant complètement à l'extérieur le grand favori Ace Impact qui place son accélération. Enesto également qui revient de très loin. Ace Impact de plus en plus fort qui fait quelque chose d'assez extraordinaire ici, qui remporte sa 6e victoire consécutive. Et l'Arc de Triomphe, le premier doublé. Jockey Club, Arc de Triomphe depuis 20 ans. Depuis Dalakani. Ace Impact, Christian Demuro pour la 2e fois dans l'Arc. Jean-Claude Rouget.
S-Impact qui rentre dans l'histoire, qui demeure invaincu, qui éclabousse de sa classe l'Arc de Triomphe édition 2023. Debout sur les étriers, Christian Demuro avec S-Impact s'impose donc dans cet arc.